Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast. We are Jeff and Terra Mattson, a husband and wife team who is shrinking the integrity gap in our own lives and helping others do the same. I'm a leadership and organizational development coach, and Terra is a licensed marriage and family therapist.
We believe that if you have a following, you are a leader, and how you lead matters. Whether you are leading in the home, work, or community, we are bringing you biblical, clinical, and relational wisdom to help you in every relationship that matters most to you. None of us do this perfectly, but we are leaning into the reality of our humanity and profound wisdom of grace. This is your first time to our podcast, I just want to say welcome. And for those of you who have been around a while, you know that we are a trauma-informed professional counseling and organizational and leadership development firm. Woo, that's a mouthful. In the Pacific Northwest. So we're located just outside of Portland, Oregon. And Jeff and I wrote the book, Shrinking the Integrity Gap Between What Leaders Preach and Live. We wrote this in an effort to help both emerging and seasoned leaders address their own childhood and leadership trauma so that we can begin to create healthier systems, because that stuff it hangs with us. So we want to create healthier systems in homes and churches and business and communities, knowing that God's grace meets us in wide ways. And the story, chronicled in the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill's podcast, some of the news in the last couple of years about Hillsong, all of these things are rising questions for the church and those outside the church about trauma, abuse, and just church wounds. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. We have our guest, Amber Jones, who is the founder and president of GraceStory Ministries. She's an advocate for families and individuals who are in need of hope. Amber, author of Grace Story's Instagram. She is also has a podcast and My Grace Story, where she draws from her own story of childhood trauma and her journey to wholeness in order to inspire others to take their own first initial steps towards healing. Amber's other favorite job titles are, she's also a homeschool mama of 4 precious kiddos. She's a wife to her high school sweetheart, and she's a beef rancher at their own farm. And I'm just so excited to have Amber here. I met her at the American Association for Christian Counselors, and just a kindred spirit, and I'm passionate about what she's doing. So thank you, Amber, for being here today.
Thank you for the invite, Tara. And hearing that last beef rancher part of the bio, it always makes me chuckle, because I grew up in the heart of downtown Cincinnati, city girl through and through. So I'm truly living my unexpected best life. Never would have seen myself as a farmer.
I love it. Well, I know Jeff and your husband connected over that beef ranch piece, and you're learning everything. So what has one thing that the farm has taught you in the last few years that has surprised you?
That you can get dirty and survive. That's one thing. But also just an appreciation for nature that I never would have had before. And then as far as like practically getting into Darren's world, when I first moved out here to the farm, it was like, what have I done? You know, I love public speaking. I love people. I am in the middle of nowhere, planted in a cornfield. Like, how in the world can I, connect from here with the world that I want to so help? And it started with me being able to slow down that lifestyle and then intentionally get into his world. And we really have become such a team because of that. Introducing him, going into the farm life and getting my hands dirty and realizing the joy and love that he has for that. And then that some of that has become mine now.
It's so fun, the adventures that we go on when we say yes to the Lord. And he does, farm life does slow you down. So I can imagine you out there in the farm and going, where are all the people?
Yeah.
Well, let's just talk to our listeners a little bit about your story. Set the tone for what we're going to be talking about when we talk about trauma, abuse, and church wounds. So share a little bit about your backdrop.
Yeah, I was 5 years old when I sat my parents down, and I can picture it now. Our golden yellow, this is the 80s, you can tell by this, but like the golden yellow velvet ribbed couch that we had in our living room.
Mm-hmm.
And my feet just barely dangled over the edge. I had a bad habit of picking my fingernails when I had something important to say, and my pigtails were, just dangling along with tickling my neck. But I had some important news that I had asked my parents if they would sit down and listen. And so in my most grown up 5-year-old voice, I really felt this. I remember, I can picture it. I remember being there and had told them, the way they were comparing my older brother, who's 15 months older than me, and myself, he never lied. I lied to see if people believed me and all this. And I remember sitting them down and just telling them that if they wouldn't compare us, I thought it might help me be a better little girl. And my dad thought it was cute and he chuckled, and my mom was completely silent. And I know that this is just, that's a small story. It is kind of cute. I mean, imagining your 5-year-old sitting you down to tell you parenting advice, but it shows a bit of the window into our family and what it looked like to live in a family that, a word you would be accustomed to would be attunement, but that basic lack of understanding of what are needs and wants and how do we meet those for our kids. Our family. So I mentioned growing up in downtown Cincinnati, my dad was a PR director for a small Bible college there. And we really had on the external, on the outside, we looked like the classic skirty, that's what I call them, the skirty American Christian family. And behind closed doors, though, things were a completely different story. There was so much dysfunction that was happening in our home. And, I like to insert this. When we go back, and look at our stories, it is not to shame or blame my parents or your parents. We go back just to get the story straight. And today I'm so grateful for those who are listening. Just also to let you know, so you don't worry too much for my parents. They are so supportive of our family sharing our story. And so they're all in on this, helping other families learn and grow from some of the mistakes that we made. But yeah, behind closed doors, things were falling apart. Both of my parents had come from families where they had their own silent suffering. And they were trying to do better. And they were creating our normal. And that was a new family dynamic for us. And it still wasn't healthy.
I think it's a really helpful back story. But at the same time, Amber, many are going, I'm confused. I don't understand how this would have been a difficult thing. What I am hearing you say is that lack of attunement to emotional and just basic God-given needs and how that plays out over time. So maybe play that out a little bit with your parents on board. I'm glad you said that because it does help the listeners to relax a little bit.
Yeah, because they're always like, how do your parents feel about this? And I'm like, they're our biggest cheerleaders. And that doesn't always happen either. Yeah.
That is rare. And it's a beautiful part of the story we'll get to. But that is often what keeps people from wanting to look back, is because it feels like we're blaming our families rather than, I appreciate you saying that, it's about naming things and calling things and better understanding who we are and why we do what we do.
Right.
So fast forward a little bit of how did that lack of attunement play out as you guys are like the traditional American Christian family, but at home, how did it look different as you get a little older?
Yeah. And another thing I like to insert is that family roles in these dysfunctional homes are different. So your experiences, it's kind of like witnessing a car wreck. Everybody has a different perspective of the same event, but because of our vantage point or place, we kind of interpret those events differently. And so this is my story. This isn't the story of my siblings. So I like to just put that out there to protect them as well a little bit. But for me, my role was that of the hero. And that sounds great. Like, ooh, do we all want to be a hero? But my job that that I had was to keep everybody safe. I was my parents' go-to counselor. I was the mom because my mom was quite distraught and depressed. And so I had to make sure my siblings were doing where they should, making sure our school uniforms were ready. And by 8 years old, I was pushing the grocery cart down all the aisles and picking out what we were going to have for supper. And when you start putting ages to some of this, there were nights where I would sit up because I would listen outside my parents' door to them as they argued. And I would just try to figure out how I could de-escalate this the next day. And I might have been 10 or 11. And I would carry that load and I'd go crawl in bed. And I journaled a lot. I'm a writer. This is how I process. And I remember journaling out some of those events where I'd hear the other kids getting disciplined, and I would just sit outside the door and count. And that was my way of being with them. And then I would feel like I had abandoned them when I went away, because I just couldn't count anymore and listen to it. And so, some of those instances are the ones that, trauma isn't the event itself. It's the meaning we take away. And I internalized those things as my failure, and I had failed to protect, and I would have been little, it wasn't really my responsibility to console my parents or to make their marriage work, but it felt like that.
Yeah, you're speaking to many people who are listening, and you're naming things for them. It's often that we find high capacity leaders with playing that role as the hero in their stories, learning very young how to take responsibility. And I feel the weight of those emotions and how heavy that is for you at 8, 9, 10 years old. So I think it's important as you talk about those ages, that's key as we look back and we recognize, wow. And then you look at your own children or other children that age and recognize the reality there.
And that was some of what actually started waking me up to the need to go back. I knew something was off again, and I had done a lot of schooling in psychology. So I knew behavior and some of that background. So I knew I'd probably have to take a look at it at some point. But when I started having my own children and realizing, okay, this is what 5 looks like. This is what should be happening with a healthy developmental milestone for 5 or 8 or 10. And there were different times I would just sit in the living room and look at my husband, who is a fantastic father, and just grieve the loss of having a daddy, and realizing you can't regain those moments.
Speak to that with your dad being in ministry and a little more public in your area, figure as a leader. What was that like as growing up and knowing that we are the family that everybody looks at?
Yeah. And loves, funny, just he has the personality that just draws people to him. He's fantastic. And yet, and so this is the other delineation. It wasn't every day. And I think that that's part of the trauma, is when you're waiting for the shoe to fall, like the next, well, what is the next time going to be? And you're always judging to see, is this one where I come in from school and head upstairs, or is this the time where I need to, maybe step in and smooth some things over? Always just wondering, not sure what the next explosive lecture is going to be or what it's going to be about. And then mixed in there are some very good times. He was public relations, and so we got to travel all over the country with him, and amazing vacations and trips to see unique things. And so there were good times. And I think that's where some of the minimizing can come in with our story, when we say, well, it wasn't all bad. Maybe I'm making it up. Maybe it really wasn't as bad as I remember. There's always somebody worse than my story. So,
yeah, I want to point that out before we move on, is that being dismissive of anything that was sad is actually a signal of trauma, because healthy leaders and healthy people can call something bad or sad or not good or not healthy. Like they just call it what it is,
Yeah.
versus the minimizer in us is protecting something. And so that is a cue for us, as we get more involved in our stories and we can start to grieve and name them. It doesn't wash away all the good, but it brings actually more wholeness to the stories. So it sounds like
Yeah.
when you had kids, you started to awaken and going, okay, I've got some stuff here I need to look at. So with the painful pieces of your story, and then you started GraceStory, kind of connect the dot there of how this came about. And I know that was an incredible step of faith for you, just knowing the bits of what I've heard today. Talk about those early steps.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as the years passed and I really started digging into the work, there were different times throughout the years that milestones had been met to just reinforce that I was valued for what I did, and that I was useful. And this can give us this jaded lens with which we see life. So I kind of approach life like, well, God has put me here to serve others. Like I'm here to make sure people are okay. And that's my purpose. That's my value. And somehow God knew I was strong enough to take it and come out okay on the other side. The verse that we often reference about Romans 8:28, him working all things together for good. I seriously, for a long time, thought, well, he thinks I'm okay. Like he knows I can take it. And I just learned to pour myself into others because that's where I was affirmed, loved, and found purpose. And so I figured that's what I'm here for, And so, I kind of got to the point where I was like, wow, there's got to be more though, because I find myself in women's ministry, even before starting GraceStory, I find myself in women's ministry teaching, like almost begging these women, like God wants an intimate relationship with you. Like you get this chance. You should take this because he loves you. And I woke up one morning and said, you know what? I'm not teaching this anymore until I believe it's also for me. And I can believe it for everybody else. I can teach it to my kids. I can see it play out in the life of my husband. But somehow, for some reason, I believe that I'm the exception, that I'm getting into heaven on a technicality, that I'm going to see the look of disappointment on God's face. Like I had to let her in, just, go find your mansion and hang out there because I wish I didn't have to, but this is a technicality and I'm letting you in. So as I started GraceStory, I had already come to that point where I'd dived in, done some of the deeper trauma healing and gone past talk therapy and really got in there to move the trauma so that it didn't have the same impact, when you go back and so much more about that, Tara. But I started GraceStory in 2019. It was with some of that naivety, like, okay, now I've gotten help. There's this void missing in the church where, we need to make that bridge to counseling and bring these two kind of worlds together because they really do align, and God cares about this and restoration and healing. And well, to back up just a little bit, I had learned to tell the stories because I'm naturally a little bit vulnerable of a person. And so I'd learned to tell the stories, but I'd never felt them.
That's key right there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if someone is saying like, well, yeah, I'm ready to tell my story. And I get asked that all the time. Like, how do you know you're ready to tell your story? Have you gone back to feel the stories? And that was part of when we talk about focusing in on the journey, focusing in on the processing, I had shared our family story, even with my dad at men's retreats and churches. And that was an incredible time of working closely together to find some healing, even in that relationship. But when we got to these men's retreats and we as a father-daughter team stood up there and shared, this is the impact of my actions as a father, I stood up and said, this is how it still impacts me today and carries over into being a wife and mommy. And people would say like, wow, okay, how do we do it? Like, but there was no good follow-up. And so it's almost as if we're saying it's possible, it's out there, go get it. And once people were related and opened up, there's no way for them to follow up with what they'd recognized the need to be. And so as I came out of my my trauma processing, I just asked God, how did he want to redeem my story? Was it a book or speaking? What did that look like? And out here on our farm one Sunday afternoon, God just poured out the vision for GraceStory, a ministry that creates sacred spaces where we combine the relatability of storytellers like my dad and I had done, but then follow that up right away with these master's level instructors like yourself, Terra, who are able to come and say, this is what enmeshment looks like. This is what codependency, or this is how you set healthy boundaries, or spouse betrayal, like taking these concepts and being able to break it down so we can understand it and have practical tools right there to begin working through our stories. We do that as well with the podcast that we have, GraceStory Podcast, and just trying to pair up those. There's a story, but it's not just about the relatability. It's about what do we do with it once we're open.
That's what that was, that kindred place for you and I, where it's the how. It's the how. So we all love a really good story, but there's all these gaps, and people listening will also be like, okay, I didn't get much of the how, but I will say, that's when you take the next step and check out GraceStory Ministries or Living Wholehearted, or, some of the organizations where we're getting into the meat, but it's slow. This process is slow, and we do not like slow. We like fast, and we love the miracle stories where one day I'm blind and the next I see. And yet there's this, learning how to see again. Like there's just this process that, and the trauma, the nightmares, the things that come back that are part of the humanity. And I love that about what you're connecting here with your story and the story of so many others. Before we move forward, there's so many questions I want to go down. I want to hit on something you said about you and your dad and telling your story, how often that is the case for many leaders as they can stand up and tell everybody where to go, what to do. Here's what happened for me. But the not feeling it and the not doing the deeper work. So maybe talk about the reality of how long did that process take, or is in process. I'm assuming there's still more going on, so that people don't think it's like an overnight kind of thing.
Yeah. So I had started what I say is like the talk therapy part of my journey. I had not dived into anything like EMDR or CBT, nothing that really moved. And I remember leaving my counselor's office saying, like, I still feel broken, but he's saying I'm really great. And that's one of the things we try to share with GraceStory is, you know what, if you're not connecting with one, not every counselor has the same specialties. They don't all come from the same approach. So it's okay to try again. Like that's not saying, that's not misguided loyalty. It's just find a good fit. We're working with people and we need to connect and trust them in order to get to the point where we can really dive in with those most vulnerable places. But as far as a timeline, once I really started getting into the work, it took me about 3.5 years. And I call the first year my year of anger.
Yeah.
Where I felt all the anger I'd never felt. And a lot of times I would turn that in on myself because we can control that, right? Like, well, if it's my fault, then I can at least do something. It feels like I can do something with that. I can at least be angry with myself. And then being angry with God, like, where were you and why did this happen? And then year 2 was my year of just absolute debilitating anxiety and feeling like I have a lot of spiritual trauma along with that. There were times when, I think this is another insert just for people with spiritual trauma. We can look at it and be like, well, but that was God's word. I mean, my dad or my pastor was God to me. And the truth is sometimes when there is unchecked authority, that is breeding ground for abuse. And so that in itself is an opportunity for us to go back and say, maybe there were some things here that I need to take a look at. But there were times when my dad would just want me to stop lying, right? So again, as a young girl, he'd come in and sit on the side of my bed at night and tell me about hell and how awful it was, and that it was, you'd never stop burning, and all the bad guys were there. And I just would lay there looking at my glow in the dark stars on the ceiling, just absolutely terrified, like, oh my goodness, I'm going to drop in right now. The Bible says that Jesus comes as a thief in the night, so I'm not safe at night. I'm fine tomorrow. I can sin tomorrow, but not tonight, and just some of the, and I call it rubble, the rubble that we start putting on in between, and we eventually are not really sure what is the right God narrative, because we just take all of that on and it starts to build up. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you're speaking for many kids who grow up in the church and maybe more unhealthy, spiritually abusive systems. And again, parents aren't trying; they don't know
Right,
that they're not trying to do that.
He just wanted me to not lie.
Yeah, but often, just from the psychological and the spiritual formation place, I just want to say a lot of times that's first generation Christians, because you come from a lot of chaos and trauma, and then the clear lines, the all or nothing thinking fits really well, and we take the Bible in a certain direction. And then that's not always the case, though. It also can be certain denominations or just, but it is often trauma fused with the interpretation of the Bible. And then that gets created. And those of us with trauma are attracted to more clear cut church organizations, ones that are all or nothing, versus the more gray places where you have to have a really intimate relationship with Jesus, and it's not so clear cut all the time. So I'm hearing that for your dad, but I'm also hearing that for you as a little girl going, oh my goodness, I'm scared to death. And he's trying to help you not lie. So talk a little bit about how go ahead.
I think that is another key point about church trauma, is that those of us who have come from those black and white denominations and backgrounds also tend to, like, church tends to be your everything. So it's your family, it's your hobbies, it's your community. You go to church potlucks to hang out together, it's youth night. And then also thinking about just like the music is Christian that's playing on the background of your radio, and all of those things. So later, what I began to realize is, when I was in a safe place, the triggers, because there was Christian, just was the thread that went through everything. And we like to, compartmentalize our trauma, like, well, that was physical trauma, this was relational, and, and so on. When really it's a little more bit of that Venn diagram, like spiritual trauma kind of looped through all of it for me. So I might be sitting in a church service completely safe later on and hear a worship song that had played in the background, just in our vehicle. And this really did happen, where all of a sudden I'm sitting in church, but I was back in that minivan traveling down the highway, and that song was in the background. And, there was an altercation that happened in the vehicle, and it was just really unhealthy, very abusive. And I just remember, so now I'm sitting in church years later, stunned, unready for that to be a trigger, tears streaming down my face, and just frozen again. And that's how that trauma can look, where you're just like, I wasn't asking to be triggered. I wasn't prepared for it because I didn't know that tie was there.
Yeah, I think you're normalizing too, for those that have had any sort of spiritual abuse, and the way the brain, God designed it, it maps it out. That I've had clients and friends, and maybe even a bit in my own story, times where even reading the Bible or praying or the worship songs that we often point people towards, I think that's normalizing that those can be a part of the trigger for a season until you've done some of that healing around that emotional brain. So thank you for saying that, because I think somebody needed to hear that right now, and to normalize that. And it doesn't mean, and coming from those systems, you think, oh my gosh, I'm leaving God altogether, or he's leaving me, or if I don't open my Bible, hell's gonna come down.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about that. A lot of people lose their faith in this process because they blame, when pastors and spiritual leaders have huge integrity gaps. Again, it's their own stories, their own stuff playing out. And in worst case scenarios, it's narcissists that are in the pulpit. For you, how did you not lose your faith? Like, what's this grace piece here? Because you seem to still really love Jesus and the church and are moving toward rather than away.
Yeah. I know one of the questions that I so often get is, where was God when all the bad stuff went down? And I think that we wrestle with that. And for me, it looked like understanding that rubble that I mentioned that had been piled on and had kept me for so long from seeing the true character of God. And I think that getting that part of the story straight is vital to understanding our own story and being able to cultivate a relationship with God again that is based on honesty and in understanding his true character. For me, going through the counseling journey, it was like taking one of those rocks, that rubble, and looking at it, naming it for what it was. And eventually I would see like, oh wait, is that eyeballs? And I think they're smiling at me, like not in a creepy way, but just like, is there really a God on the other side of this? And the layers would keep coming off. And then I could see there was a face there. And there were times, and he's smiling, not just staring at me, but he was smiling. And eventually I got to the place where, and this is part of the work with visualizing and understanding, like some of that EMDR stuff, that CBT, but being able to come to the place where I went from, I'm sure I'm going to see Jesus's look of disappointment when I get into heaven on a technicality, because I checked all the boxes that my religion, black and white, said I have to do, to being able to sit on my bed, as a mom of 4, and this is within the last couple of years, and just inviting God to come into the room and share the disappointment that I had about a certain situation that had happened, and to picture the God of the universe sitting crisscross applesauce, right across from me on the bed, and looking into my eyes, and just to realize, like, he wasn't afar off that whole time. He was unpacking that rubble with me. And when I got to the end of that journey, realizing he wasn't just standing there, he wasn't just aware. He was holding me. It's kind of like that 6-year-old. Vivian is my 6-year-old, and she matches her name. It means full of life, and she's got it to a T. But she will pile those stuffed animals just all around her, and you can hardly find her. And sometimes I see that being the way this rubble works, where we've just been piled, overwhelmed with this trauma and the things that life has handed us. And it can seem like God is so distant. And as we begin to look at that stuff and name it for what it is, we see he's not just on the other side, but he actually has been holding us the whole time and moving those things as we give him permission to move those things and take a look at them with us.
It's beautiful, beautiful picture of Vivian too. Just God sees the child that he made in each of us, and he sees your heart and has seen your heart all along as he's calling you out of the rebel and loving you every step of the way. So that's a beautiful way to end. And I think before we close, I just am thinking about those who are like, this is my system, or I'm coming out and I want to leave it all. I don't want to go look back. It's common to stay silent. And I want you to maybe speak to a little bit about, why do you think people stay silent in these kinds of systems? And then maybe speak to the person who needs some encouragement and next steps.
Yeah, there is a lot of risk in speaking up. There can feel like there's almost too much to lose. We can fear loss, whether we're going to lose our position, if we work within that environment, like as a job. It can feel like we'll lose our family or the community. One of our greatest needs as a human being is a sense of belonging. And so it takes a lot to overcome that fear of losing our people, so to speak. And then there's also the misguided loyalties. So often when we're coming from some of this, like I did, the institution can be put over the individual. And so there's this idea of loyalty to the greater good. Like if I come forward and tell what happened, then this could cost this person their ministry. And I know that they seem to be helping a lot of other people, and it can feel selfish. But even with my work with GraceStory, over and over and over, there's stories of people who have been deeply wounded by a leader or an authority figure, and the individual doesn't come forward. Or when they do, unfortunately, there are times when the leadership team dismisses the situation with just kind of a pat answer because they don't know what to do with it. Or they fear destroying someone's ministry as well. And so they just, we just aren't going to deal with that. Actually, over time, this can lead to corporate trauma, or that side of things where maybe it didn't happen to you, but it just leads to a sense of distrust, and essentially it opens the door to question everything when a spiritual leader acts in a bullying or abusive way. And so it can open us up to say, well, now knowing what I know about him, if this was not true, if he spoke out of his own wounding on this, what is true? And so then that can also, like we said already, lead to minimizing, because we can always find somebody who has it worse. And so we just say, well, and get to the dismissive stage where we're like, well, this is just a greater good, this is just not the right time. A lot of times it seems like it isn't until we experience a certain measure of safety that we can begin to unpack the past. And I know that was true for me. I had been out of my home for almost 10 years before I was able to really look at what had happened for what it was. And even then it's exhausting. I mean, you're already, your body, that actually takes a physical toll on your body. And when you're in survival mode, so for the people who are still in this, you may know that something needs to change, or that courage would say to stand up and say something and to confront. But another day goes by and we can find ourselves praying for the miracle that it would just be healed or just go away, because we don't know how. We don't know how to ask for help. And I think that there comes a point when we realize it's just not sustainable any longer, that we have to get help. We have to get help for our kids, if nothing else. And recently I kind of had this word picture of Moses, and we think about bravery as being the big moments. Like when Moses was talking to Pharaoh, he was brave, like throwing down the rod, calling down the plagues, like that, he was being brave then, right? But I started realizing bravery, maybe what if we thought about bravery for Moses as being when he took that first step back out of the desert? He knew the watering places. He knew the oases. He knew the paths. He was comfortable there. He had a family that, he was working with, and he knew that God was calling him into something more and bigger. And he felt very unqualified and very uncomfortable with it. And maybe that's what brave looks like, is when we know we can no longer stay silent. But bravery may be the first step of obedience, even when it's scary and we're not sure what's on the other side of saying yes.
Yeah, that's so good. It's a great way to end. And I definitely am thinking about that parent like your dad who goes, coulda, shoulda, woulda. Like, I just didn't know. And so why don't you end with an encouragement to those parents who maybe the kids are still in the home and there is plenty of time even now as you're rearing them, or your kids are grown and you can see the effects of some of this system of the church you raised them in, or the way you disciplined. What do you want to say to that parent?
Yeah. One of the resources that has been so helpful to me even is your book, Shrinking the Integrity Gap. It's been helpful to me as I lead with GraceStory and try to do that well, but also as I sift through being a recipient of trauma, to be able to have a way to put some words to it and relate. But if I go back to where I was sitting with my parents on that velvet couch that I talked about at the very beginning at the top of the podcast, there have been times when I've been able to go back and have conversation with my younger self and with my parents as well. And both in just therapy and in real life, to have those tough conversations. And there are times when, my parents will say, I just wish could have done it different. I wish I would have known what I did now. And what I tell them over and over and over is this, whether it's my parents or someone else coming with Grace Story who's asking that same question. We're watching you now. We may be adults, but we're still your kids, and it still matters, and you can live with integrity now. And so when we've lived in a home where sorry has become a byword that means nothing, it's the action that really speaks so much to us. We can see if you're walking and if you're changed, and if we can see that remorse, we know that. But hope would say, hope is the message of the gospel. It's of grace. It's the very story of imperfect humanity being invited into the perfect, sustaining, unconditional, holy love of our Heavenly Father. And that's not just for victims. That's for people who have made mistakes that they wish they could take back as well. And so I think that it's in this resting in the very goodness of being created unique, special, and being able to understand that we are forgivable, that we are lovable no matter, and that we can start from here. And that's where we can begin to understand that we're seen and known, and that's where we find hope waiting.
Amen, sister. Amen. Well, before we go, let's tell everyone where they can find more about your resources and learn more about GraceStory Ministries.
Yeah, GraceStory inspires hope by creating these sacred spaces. And so we're so excited to be able to walk and honored to walk with people who are ready to start their journey. GraceStoryMinistries.com. You can find all of our resources from that hub. One of the specific ones that I'd like to point out for those who are ready to start their journey is we have a counseling referral link on that homepage. And essentially what we do there is break down that, when you go to psychologytoday.com, you're looking for a counselor, and it can be daunting. You see all those letters on the side and don't know what they mean. And what are these therapies? I just know something's off and I need help. And so what we try to do is take that down. It's almost a personal shopper of sorts. And no matter the zip code, if you fill out that confidential form, we're going to do our best to find a Christian caring counselor in your area and connect you with them so you can start your own journey of restoration. We do have the Grace Story podcast. We have the private Facebook community where we offer support and teachings throughout the whole year. And then the highlight of our year is when we get to be together in person. And that's through our men's and women's conferences based out of Cincinnati. But we have so many people that travel in for those as well. And that information is right there on GraceStoryMinistries.com.
Fantastic. And if you want to look up livingwholehearted.com and see if there's anything we can do to help you, maybe pick up the book, Shrinking the Integrity Gap. I didn't pay Amber to say that.
Yeah, it's just that good.
Thank you. But that idea of just take the next step. Maybe ask the Lord before you close this podcast of what is the one step? And sometimes it's just even grabbing a friend who's trusted and having them sort through. But I love your resources and are so grateful for you, Amber, your story, and that it continues to help others to walk into freedom, because it is for freedom that Christ has set us free.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So thank you again. And for those of you who benefited from this podcast, make sure you leave a review, because this is an important one. And we really, in the age that we're in right now, we really want people to start to pull back the rubble and to see who God is and his heart for the church, apart from a lot of the dysfunction we bring in as human beings.
This podcast is powered by Living Wholehearted, Courageous Girls, and the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Thank you for joining us in this critical movement of shrinking our integrity gaps between what we preach and live.